welcome back to my channel. In the previous videos we talked about list, looping, slicing, copying and a great deal of other things. In today's videos let's learn about tuples. And why it is important. List work well for storing collection of items that can change throughout the life of a program. The ability to modify lists is particularly important when you are working with a list of users on a website or a list of characters in a game. However, sometimes you will want to create a list of items that cannot change. Tuples allow you to do just that. Python refers to values that cannot change as immutable, and an immutable list is called a tuple. So let's just define a tuple. Defining a tuple. A tuple looks just like a list, except you use parentheses instead of square brackets. Once you define a tuple, you can access individual elements by using each item's index, just as you would for a list. For example, if we have a rectangle that should always be a certain size, we can ensure that its size doesn't change by putting the dimensions into a tuple. So let's just add dimensions into a tuples. Dimensions instead of square brackets we use simple brackets, we use parentheses. Let's dimension be 250. Now let me just print the dimensions index 0, and we talked about that index 0 is 200 and index 1 is 50. Okay, now if you print it, didn't add s here. Now if I run it, you could see that I get 200. Now if I print dimensions 1, you could see that I get 50, which is the second element. Okay, now if I put 2, if I run it, you could see that I get an error because I don't have, I just have 2 elements, so index 2 is not defined here. Okay, so that is a grave mistake. So we have just 2 index, 0 and 1, and you can't exceed beyond 1. We define the tuple dimensions using parentheses instead of square brackets. We print each element in the tuple individually using the same syntax we have been using to access elements in a list. There is no, there is not a big difference. Just use the square brackets and just define the indexing. Let's see what happens if we try to change one of the items in the tuple dimensions. Now let me define the dimensions at index 0 be 300. Okay, now I changed the index. Okay, I changed the index. I didn't change the index, I changed the first value, the dimension, from 200 to 300. And I told you earlier that Python uses tuples so that the values can't be changed, the values are maintained. This is why we get an error. Okay, you could see here that tuple object doesn't support items assignment. Okay, 300 is not here, and you just couldn't change it. This is beneficial because you want Python to raise an error when a line of code tries to change the dimensions of the rectangle. Tuples are technically defined by the presence of a comma. The parentheses make them look neater and more readable, If you want to define a tuple with one element, you need to include a trailing comma. It doesn't make sense to build a tuple with one element, but this can happen when tuples are generated automatically. Now let's talk about looping through all values in a tuple. We already discussed looping in a list. Now let's discuss it in dimensions. Now let's discuss it in tuple. Okay, use parenthesis 200 and let's say 30, and then for this is for dimension and dimensions. Don't forget to put colon here, and then just print dimension, not with s. Okay, and you could see that the two values are displayed here. Now if I want to add more names, let's say that I add more numbers, sorry, let's say that I add more numbers. Okay, just for the sake of understanding, 50, 60, 70. Okay, and I just want to make a loop. Don't forget your colon, and just print and run, and you could see that all the values are displayed here. You should remember that you can't change the numbering, the index values in tuple. Python returns all the elements in the tuple, just it will be for a list. Now let's talk about writing over a tuple. Writing over a tuple. Although you can't modify a tuple, you can assign a new value to a variable that represents a tuple. So if you wanted to change our dimensions, we could redefine the entire tuple. Let me just give you an example so that it gets clear to you. Okay, let me give you an example. Dimensions, dimension 200 to let's say 30, and let me add in comment French and quotes original dimensions. Okay, and let me just print it. Okay, so there are no errors. Now you can exceed for dimension and dimensions. This is my loop. Print dimension. Let me run it. Okay, there are no errors. Good. Now let's just proceed. Okay, now let me just modify. Okay, let me modify the dimensions. Okay, let me just modify the dimension. So dimensions. Okay, let me just add new values, 300 to let's say 100. Okay, and let me add a comment French and quotes, new line, let's say modified dimensions, and let me just run it. So okay, there are no errors. Now let me just proceed. Let me write a loop for dimension and dimensions, and just me French dimension. Okay, so modified dimensions are this. Okay, It is good, it is not that bad. One thing that you need to remember is that I can't change the tuple, I can't change the values of the tuple, but I can modify it. I can, add a new command, a new structure, and this is how I would proceed with my work. So you need to understand what tuples are, why they're important, and you need to remember its structure. And tuples are very important. I also talked about its significance at the start of the lecture. Now let's proceed, let's talk more. When compared with lists, tuples are simple data structures. Use them when you want to store a set of values that shouldn't be changed throughout the life of a program. You need to understand it. Okay, let me give you an assignment. Let's say that you go to a restaurant and there are 5 basic foods. Think of 5 simple foods and store them in a tuple. Use a for loop to print each food the restaurant offers. Try to modify one of the items and make sure that Python rejects the change. Okay, you get an error. Now the restaurant changes its menu, replacing 2 of the items with different foods. Add a line that rewrites the tuple and then use a for loop to print each of the items on the revised menu. I hope you could do it, and it is not that difficult. Or you could also try that you invite someone to your home, like 5 people, and two of them are not coming. So now you have to modify the tuple. So do it and try it on your own.